So welcome today on this very special series, a food project called Flavors of Brazilians, Exploring the Diversity of Jewish Food to Combat Antisemitism. And this is a project and not just a podcast or a YouTube interview, but stay tuned because we're just getting started. And I'm Paushali Lass, and this educational project that we're going to start today, uses the rich culinary history of the Jewish people as a powerful tool to combat and address anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment. This project will have three primary educators who are Jewish, living in Israel, that's Sarah Sassoon, living in New York City, Jennifer Abadi, and Tapan Dubai Yehudi, who lives in Austria, who's going to join us from the next episode. And I'm the moderator. I'm Paushali Lass, and I'm based in Germany. So we have two of our educators today, Jennifer Abadi joining us from New York City. She is of Mizrahi and Sephardic origin, and Sarah Sassoon living in Jerusalem, and she is an Iraqi or Babylonian Jew living in Israel, Jerusalem. So, ladies, thank you very much for joining me. And would you like to just share a little bit about yourself? So we begin with Jennifer.
Thank you, Paushali. It's really nice to see you again and be on this podcast. Yes, I'm beaming in from New York City, as you would say. And basically, I'm a cooking instructor and cookbook writer, focusing on the foods of North Africa, the Mediterranean, Middle East and Central Asia, roughly. I know it's a lot of areas. And then my kind of main focus is on the Jewish communities within these regions. And I like to always say that I'm what I call or introduce myself as a recipe preserver and developer. And the means in which I do that is through my teaching of recipes and dishes. Sometimes I talk about the food and lecture on the cuisine of a certain region or a specific dish. And in the cookbooks that I write.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
And my background, I'm sorry,
yeah.
I mentioned that my background, I'm half Ashkenazi and half Mizrahi. Some people say Sephardi. I feel more Mizrahi. One side of my family comes from Latvia, and the other one comes from Aleppo, Syria, so Halabi. So that's how I started with the Middle Eastern food, because I grew up mostly with Syrian food from the Syrian community that is still mostly in New York, Brooklyn area, and also other parts of New Jersey and so on.
Right. Wow. Fascinating. So lots to discover there. Now we move on to Sarah. Would you
Hi, Paushali. Yes, so I'm an author, poet, and educator. All my grandparents are Iraqi Jewish. My father was born in Baghdad. And my writing has circled around this idea of immigration and displacement. And I only knew about my Iraqi Jewish heritage through the food I ate through my grandparents and the customs we had, which were different to other Jews because we were Babylonian Jewish, not Ashkenazi like the people of the main Jewish community in Australia where I grew up. And through my writing, I'm discovering and my research. So my obsession is to research Iraqi Jewish history, Babylonian Jewish history, all the way from the Bible till now, to understand the story of where my grandparents come from, because they didn't speak about it. There was a silence. So what I've discovered in my research is that food tells a story. And that's what I'm very happy to share with you today.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm looking forward to hearing your stories connected with food. But let's get started with why we are even doing this project and why now. What sparked the idea to talk about Jewish food and combating anti-Semitism? So a few months ago, Jennifer received a rather harsh email from a lady in response to her article on a dish that she learned from her grandmother. So, Jennifer, would you please share with our audience what was the email about?
So basically, there was an article had come out in some magazine in the US, and it was just focusing, it wasn't even a very long, it was like a one-page short little article, and half of it was a recipe that I learned from my grandmother that I grew up with called �Mizrahi, which is a rice and lentil dish with fried onions. And so I was interviewed about, just very briefly, about my background on the Syrian side. And then they asked, the writer asked that I prepare the dish so they could have someone come and photograph it, and then they could publish the recipe that I actually have in one of my cookbooks of family recipes from Syria. And so I thought it was a pretty simple, benign, it wasn't political or anything like that. It was just, this is a family recipe. This is something that the Syrian Jews make. It's sort of a staple, even today. It's something I grew up with, something that, everybody still makes and thinks of as like one of the top 10 recipes that are commonly made. And then I received this email saying from someone who actually was originally from Iraq, and I understood lives in the US, left years ago. And basically, I thought it was going to be a nice email of somebody saying, oh, I grew up with this recipe and so on too, and I love it. But instead, I quickly realized it was the opposite. It was an email basically trying to re-educate me, quote unquote, about what is Jewish and that this is not Jewish. And she didn't even imply, she outright came out and said that claimed that I was stealing, and then went further to claim that, oh, and you're stealing this recipe, which is an Arab dish, and you don't even give credit to the Arabs, and you're stealing it. And this is what you do because this is what Jews do. And so I was just like, oh, okay, now we're getting to the point. Obviously, this is another thing since October 7th that was deeply rooted already, but is much more on the surface now, that people are just feeling very emboldened to just straight out come out and say Jews steal, they steal everything. I think it's tied in with from the land, from our culture, down to the food, down to every detail, down to this very dish. It was stolen, and how dare you not give credit where credit is due, and went on. But then she also went on, which I thought was even more sort of interesting, to say, these are the dishes. She even decided to tell me, these are the dishes that I know to be Jewish that you can teach. Like telling me as a teacher, because this is what I do as a teacher and a researcher, you can teach. So she went on to list things like matzo ball soup and things like that, so gefilte fish and so on. And I was just so incensed by the whole thing because I've been doing this for maybe 20 years, and most of what I'm doing, because the truth is that still the majority of Jews in the United States are Ashkenazim. So even though I grew up with some of that, because that's what you see in stores and restaurants and things like that, and I like the food, but I grew up with the Syrian food. And so even trying to, over the many years, just telling even Jews what's also Jewish has been something that I've been trying to, share with other people. And then this idea that this is Jewish, but this is all that's Jewish. I was like, okay, there's so many layers to this.
Right. So this also actually echoes a broader narrative that seems to have gained momentum, especially since the October 7th attack, that Jews are mainly Ashkenazim, so they need to go back to Europe, or that Israel is a white colonialist entity. And what about the other Jews, though? And that's what we want to bring to light, right? So all the thousands of years of Jewish history and the diverse Jewish communities that are there. So for the benefit of our audience, okay, would you, Sarah, maybe I'll just come to you. Would you just quickly give a brief introduction to the types of Jewish communities that are there? Jennifer mentioned Ashkenazi, and she also said she's part Ashkenazi and part Mizrahi, but what are the Jewish communities that are there in the world today?
Wow, there are so many. Maybe the way to describe the Jewish community is to understand that the Jews were originally from Judea. There were two exiles in two periods, 586 BCE when the first temple was destroyed, and then in 70 by the Babylonians, then 70 CE, the second temple was destroyed by the Romans. At both times there were exiled Jews. So you have Jews in Ethiopia, you have Jews in Yemen, all the way from that first exile, the Yemenite Jews for sure. You have Jews and throughout the Middle East, Morocco, there was Jews in Libya. There's no more Jews there now. Barely any Jews in Morocco now. So the Middle East, there was full of Jews, but now there's no Jews there really. But you have Jews who have those those traditions. Like I'm an Iraqi Jew, but there were only 3 Jews in Iraq today. So that's the Babylonian Jewish community just dispersed throughout the world. So you have the Jews from the Middle East and those early diaspora Jews. But then what happened was that the Jews from Babylonia, which became the center after the Roman destruction of the temple, they went to Spain and also to Europe. So then you have German Jewish communities, you have the Spanish communities, but there was the expulsion in 1492. So they also spread. They went to Holland, for example. So you have the Amsterdam Sephardic community, England. Gosh, you could do a whole podcast just on where Jews come from. And then you obviously have the Jews in America, and you have the Jewish communities in Australia. And the ones who went to Europe, they developed their own traditions,
Right.
which became the Ashkenazi traditions. So you have 2 different kind of ways of adapting to the environment. And so really the split is Middle Eastern Jews, then you have the Sephardic Jews who are more the Spanish, Portugal descent, and then you have the European Jews who are the Ashkenazi. And majority of Jews in America, Australia, in Western countries are usually Ashkenazi, but there is big now Jewish communities from the MENA communities and Sephardic communities as well. They are there. They just haven't been that loud.
Right. And then you also have in places like India, the Jews went to India
Right.
and
And
also
they're also an
Iran.
ancient community from those exiles.
Yeah, absolutely. But let's go back to you, Jennifer. And, you know, when I talk about the Jewish communities and the diaspora, one thing that always, dis it's kind of a distinguishing factor is the Jews did adapt, but they did not assimilate, especially in terms of food. So they kept their food laws, right? So the kosher food, the laws of kashrut. So would you explain to those especially who don't know what Jewish food laws are, what are the food laws that Jews generally know?
So the very basic, it can be very complex, but the most basic parts, which is really, to me, whenever anyone has come to me and say, what is Jewish food, or what makes something Jewish, or even is there such a thing as Jewish? I've done a lot of thinking about it. And I think that in its most basic level, you have to look at the backbone of the Jewish food laws and rituals, which would be a few things. One would be the laws of kashrut that you mentioned. So what is basically that, without getting into too many details that even I don't even know? One of them is not mixing milk and meat together in the same dish or in the same menu. So like when you're sitting down to eat and you have a meal, you're not going to have milk and meat together in one dish, and you're not going to have it in the same sitting, right? In the same meal. The other thing would be certain foods that are never going to be kosher and therefore are what we call treif, or not kosher, and you can never eat it. So most basic that almost everybody knows, even if they're not Jewish, is pork, right? So pork is something that will never be kosher in any form. Shellfish as well. And then there are different cuts. And there's different cuts of animals that's another level. And then there's the next category that I look at, which is Shabbat, which stands on its own, right? That's every week, every Friday through Saturday. sundown to sundown, that has its foods and rituals because of certain rituals and laws where you can't use electricity and, certain other things you can't do. So how has that changed and dictated the types of foods you can do? More specifically, because you can't actually physically cook once Shabbat begins. And then the other thing is all the holidays, and the biggest holidays, or I would say the most common holidays celebrated from the least observant to the most orthodox, things like Rosh Hashanah, which is the new year, Pesach, or Passover in the spring. I'd say those are the two, probably the biggest that almost everyone who considers themselves Jewish celebrates. And then there are all these others like Purim, Purim, and so on. So, and then there's certain foods that are symbolic that are used for those holidays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. And they date back to the kosher laws also come from the Bible itself, right? So it dates back to thousands of years, right?
Right.
Um,
It's interpretations of things that are dictated in there. Yeah.
mm-hmm. Now, there's also been another development of Jewish food over the years based on exile, based on antisemitism, blood libel. So would you share a bit about that? Or maybe giving some examples?
Yeah, so a lot of it I discovered more, I'd heard about and understood a little bit while I was growing up, but it wasn't really until I was working on a Passover cookbook, my second book, that focused on the foods and the rituals and the customs from the Mediterranean, the Middle East, North Africa, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and parts of Europe, and interviewed people and researched and learned that there are certain recipes or certain dishes and foods that were used in a way to root out at certain times Jews. So you have two main, I would say, occasions, holidays that those who were not Jewish during, for example, during the Inquisitions, which was like a 500-year period, the ways that the inquisitors would look for Jews to persecute them was during two specific things: Shabbat and Passover. Those were the most known, where they could sort of say, oh, Jews are celebrating, which Shabbat is every Friday, right? So if they're lighting candles, for example, maybe if they have a certain kind of bread or dish they're doing, if they're whatever they're doing in their home, that was one way to detect someone, a Jewish family. And the other one was Passover that I learned. And during Passover, something like matzah, right, which is one of the most quintessential Jewish dishes. If you were to say something is absolutely Jewish and wasn't anything else, it's the flatbread for Passover, because you can't eat anything leavened during that 8-day period because of the story of the Exodus. So I spoke to several people who were interviewed in places from Egypt to elsewhere in Eastern Europe, who told me that during Passover, they would hear rumors being spread about Jews using the blood of either Muslims or Christians, depending on the country that they were living in, right? And the majority that lived there, using the blood to make the matzah. And that's such an old story, but it's also a story that's used to demonize Jews, to say that they are doing something very, sort of hidden and not, sort of evil, criminal, or to destroy other people in a way. And I was really shocked. And when at one point, when someone from Egypt was telling me this, I was surprised that he was telling that he experienced this. It wasn't an old story, that he was living to tell me this story. And then I started reading about it more and hearing about it more from people who were growing up in former USSR, Soviet nations as well, where religion was hidden, and wasn't accepted publicly. And during the Passover time, when they were making matzah and they had to hide making the matzah, it was like a big deal for them to find ways to make the matzah so that they had it, because that's a ritual you had to do to fulfill, for the most basic thing, to fulfill Pesach? And how did you get it done under cover of night and darkness, without letting the authorities or the public know? So I would say that's the most basic thing, but then there are also foods that developed, such as this one Portuguese type of sausage that is very much similar to the non-Jewish, the majority, who were making these sausages originally with pork and all these spices. And they would make it with beef or even chicken or turkey, ground turkey. And then they would use all these smoked spices so that it smelled like it had been smoked like the pork sausage. And I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, but it's called alheiras or something like that.
Alheiras,
And
yeah.
so it's a Portuguese Jewish sausage that you can
Yeah.
find sometimes, but it's Jewish because
Yeah.
it leaves out the pork.
It's like persecution can lead to so much creativity, right? So, but it's also a
Yeah,
story
in order to
of
avoid,
yeah.
I
that,
heard that
or to
when
avoid
I was in
dairy with
Portugal,
meat.
they said that the sausages were created by these Jews. It wasn't just that
Yeah,
they never had sausages before. They actually invented the sausage
that's
for
what
the
I
purpose
heard
meat to
also in
hide the
Lisbon.
meat,
Yeah,
to
so they
hide what
shaped
that
it in
wasn't
the
pork.
form of
Well, I
sausage.
don't know, because I know that people told me too, and I also read that sometimes one thing people would do at the time of the Inquisitions is they would hang sausages. I mean, it was so much a part of the culture. They would literally hang them in front of in their house.
Yeah,
Some of it might have been the storage, but it was also an indication that we are good, we're
yeah.
Catholic.
We eat
And
pork.
so if you're
Yes.
Muslim or Jewish, even,
Mm,
you didn't have that because you're not going to hang those
right.
sausages. So there was cultural things that evolved to say we are Catholic or we are Muslim or we are whatever it was, that specifically the Jews could not do.
Yeah. Okay, Jennifer, you spoke about the kosher laws from the Bible, and I'd like to ask Sarah, could you maybe mention some of the like typical biblical food, or the 7 species of Israel, and a little bit about that, and whether people in Israel, even today, because you live in Israel, how important is it even today?
Right. So it's really interesting because it's always the chicken and the egg. There's so many foods that come from um, which are part of the festivals and everything, which reflect these biblical foods. So what are they? Olive oil. No, well, there's 7 fruits of Israel. The verse in the Bible is from Deuteronomy. And it says, a land of wheat, barley, vines, fig trees, and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. And when it speaks about honey, we know that it's date honey, so it includes dates as well. And when you think about the fact that in Iraq, they didn't have necessarily honey, they had date honey. They'd squeeze dates, and that's part of the cuisine in Mesopotamia was date honey. So it was the staple diet of the people in Israel, all these foods, and these, as I said, it's reflected in all the festivals and the symbols. So, for example, these first fruits were brought for the harvest festival, which was the Shavuot festival, which was held 7 weeks after Pesach, a Passover, to the temple in Jerusalem. So it was very, very central. So the first fruits of these fruits were very much part of their everyday kind of life, but also their ritual as a people in this land. So they were very tied to the land. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
And that's the way it's presented in the Bible, and that's the way they lived their lives.
Now, you mentioned that dates were grown in Babylonia, ancient Babylonia, but dates were also popular in Iraq, and in Israel, of course, dates are very popular, right? And Ceylon, the date syrup. So, share a little bit more about dates. Living in Israel, what would you eat dates for? And yeah, give us a background about dates.
Right.
It
So the
doesn't
date
typically
actually has
feature in Ashkenazi cuisine, right? So that's why I wanna,
exactly.
yeah,
I mean,
wanna
growing up in
point that out.
Sydney, my
Mhm.
grandmother's they always had dates. She had date cookies that were baba tamar. Dates are very, very, very central from biblical times onwards. I can go through the whole, should I give you the story of dates? So as growing up, I was looking for chocolate, but there was only dates. And it goes back very far. I'm just the dates was it was cultivated as far back as 3100 BCE in Mesopotamia, and they considered it a gift from heaven in Mesopotamia. So it's an ancient fruit. Date palms were carved on the walls of Solomon's temple. Women in the Bible were called tamar, which is the Hebrew for date palm.
Right.
So you can just see how central the date was in their lives. The palm tree appeared on ancient Judean and Roman coins, and it's this again expresses that it was such a central part of the economy. In 400 BCE, Herodotus would speak of the Judean date tree with pride. He would express how useful it was because it was non-perishable. So it was very good for transporting as well. And in the first century, Pliny the Elder commented that the dates from this tree were famous for their sweetness.
Mm,
So it was really very well known, the dates from Judea.
right.
But then what happened was when the Romans took control of Israel, and in 70 CE, the Second Temple was destroyed. They destroyed the date palms because this was the integral part of the economy there. So to destroy a people, you destroy their ability to live and support themselves. So they destroyed the palm trees.
Mhm.
Um, so by the year 500, the plant was thought to have been wiped out.
Mm,
But it's worth noting that Asaf Gur, in the history of the date through the ages in the Holy Land, says the date tree wasn't actually wiped out by the Romans, but it was only wiped out until the 14th century when there was a collapse of agriculture under the Mamluks.
right.
But whatever the case was, there were no date palms in
Sure.
Judea, in Israel, in this area anymore. Um, and in 1963, what's really interesting is a Professor Yigal Yiladin and his team of archaeologists discovered a handful of 2,000-year-old date palm seeds at
Mhm.
Herod's palace in Masada. And this was a very exciting discovery because they could recultivate the ancient Judean date tree.
Mm,
But they didn't know how to do it exactly. In 2005, Dr. Elaine Solawi actually did it, and she succeeded. And she grew a date tree which they called Methuselah.
mm,
And that's a whole story in and of itself. But the real question then is, wait, we know there are a lot of dates coming from Israel. So where do these dates come from? And so as an Iraqi Jew, and studying my history and researching, the date trees in Israel were smuggled in to Israel from Iraq. Iraq used to be one of the biggest exporters of date trees. There were 600 varieties. You speak to any Iraqi Jew, speak to them about dates. They will tell you about all the different varieties they used to eat as children, as adults, if you're lucky enough to meet an older Iraqi Jew. And we don't understand that the world of dates is vast and rich and wide. And you only understand if you come from Iraq because there were so many varieties. Um, Taking date plants from Iraq was a capital crime.
mhm,
It was really dangerous to do. But a Jew from Israel, Ben Zion Israeli, he was originally from Europe, and he was a founder of a kibbutz, and he was very interested in trees, and he decided he's going to bring smuggle date trees into Israel from Iraq. And he managed to smuggle 20,000 date plants to Israel.
mhm.
But then the
It's a
problem was, how
lot.
do you plant them? I know it's a lot. And they
Yeah.
distributed them in Beersheba, but how do you plant them? How do you help
Yeah.
them grow and flourish? It's one thing bringing them, but to actually know what to do with them. So they actually brought a farmer from Basra
Mhm.
to Israel. They smuggled him in as well to
That's fine in Iraq. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah, they had no experience. The ergonomists in Israel didn't know how to, plant these date palms.
Mm.
And they actually even tried to bring experts from California. That nothing worked. So then they brought this farmer from Basra, and he was offered a lot of money to do it, and he succeeded. And that's how the date market um, and flourished in Israel.
Mhm.
Just to note that this farmer went back to Iraq, reported on his owner, Yaqub Atrakjil, I don't know how to pronounce his name exactly, of Basra, reported the whole smuggling, and the Iraqi Jew he worked for, this Yaqub, was arrested, and no one knows what happened to him.
Okay.
So he kind of paid the price for this. So what's also interesting about Iraq, that while it used to produce 3/4 of the world's dates, today its production's at 5%. I even read an article where they were importing dates. So
Mm.
it's like almost like a turnaround. In
Mm.
Israel, we are exporting our dates that we smuggled from Iraq, and their whole date economies collapsed.
Mm.
So they got rid of their Jews. 3 Jews live in Iraq, and somehow the Iraqi Jews took with them their dates,
Right.
which is really important in Iraqi Jewish food culture.
Yeah,
So
so what would you use date honey for example, the honey that comes from date? What sort of, give us some examples of food that you ate during childhood and you preserved that as part of your.
Right. So as Jennifer mentioned when we were discussing earlier, that when she was researching, everyone would speak about the Passover chalek, which is the date syrup that we use for the charoset. It's part of the Passover ritual to use this. And they actually found the recipe for this, we're using date syrup, from Rabbi Sadia Gaon, who was a famous old Babylonian sage, and he wrote this in the 9th century CE, this recipe. So this recipe goes back a long time, and the date syrup was used also with kahi. On Shavuot morning, they'd have kahi and date syrup on the kahi and kemer that they'd have. But it is an Iraqi staple as well. As I mentioned, when I was making my halak and squeezing the dates and boiling the date syrup up for my Seder this year, my Iraqi friend in Baghdad, he's a Muslim, he messaged me and said, you boiled it too long, it looks a bit thick. Um, so dates are an Iraqi staple. Also, baba tamar, date cookies that are made very well known in Iraq as well. And you use dates to sweeten stews. You don't put sugar, like my great aunt told me, for the mahasha, for the
Mhm.
stuffed dolma, vegetables, it's stuffed vegetables with rice and meat and onion. You don't put sugar. You put date syrup to sweeten it.
Yeah,
So
Mm.
very
it's
interesting.
a staple food.
Right.
And
And Jennifer, would you also use date syrup in Syrian food, like from?
Not as much, but again, the whole use of dates going back in time and becoming a significant sort of product or ingredient in Middle Eastern Jewish cooking and cuisine. Definitely during Pesach, I noticed that whenever I interviewed people from all these regions I spoke about, from North Africa to the Mediterranean, Middle East to even Central Asia, in comparison to those who had settled for generations in Europe, as the most basic ingredient for the haroset, which is another basic food for Passover in addition to the matzah, always had dates as the base. So whether it was a syrup, which is much more the Iraqi way, as Sarah was mentioning, or it was more of a paste and thick, maybe with walnuts and a little wine, which is more of what I've discovered in the either Sephardic way or also in Syria. They did that too. And in other regions where they even called it halek, but it wasn't like I had a woman who is Persian Jewish, and she would call it haleg, like, but the same word. And she would do chopped dates with other ingredients, with grapes and other ingredients. But again, that the fact that the date is always present in the paste, which is supposed to symbolize the sweetness of Pesach and the holiday, but also the mortar, right, of building the cities during the Egyptian times by the Israelites, right? So but always dates were used in that symbolic way. And I had an Egyptian who told me that when he was growing up in Egypt, instead of, or in addition to, but actually they wouldn't necessarily have the haroset paste, they would have a fresh date. They would eat a fresh date when most of us now eat haroset or halek, right? And he said, always when I was growing up during the spring, that's when the dates would ripening and they were just dropping on the ground wherever we walked, and we would just eat fresh. So we would eat fresh dates for Pesach, and I just remember eating that fresh date. That's to me Passover. So the use of dates in Jewish cooking goes back all the way. And I also wanted to mention the use of three names that what I thought was interesting for the date syrup. Whenever I spoke to Jews, depending on where they were, when they started going more east, they would say halek, but a lot of them would also say silan, which is something in Israel they use, I think, a lot of. It's like became very popular over in the last 10 years to buy silan, use silan, and a lot of chefs were using it. Like it was a rediscovery from this Iraqi way of cooking. And then I spoke to a scholar of Iraqi cuisine, not Jewish, and she told me, and also I read, they would use the term dibs or dibs. That's not, so the Jews would say halek or silan, depending on where they were settled and coming from and, in migration. And the non-Jews would say dibs or dibs for the syrup.
So it's, I think it would be fascinating to do a live once with more Jewish people or even non-Jews, from the region to see how dates are used, because dates is a very important ingredient, like from biblical times. And, I know from my Syrian Arabic friends also, they use this tamar, they say tamar like cookies, the date cookies. So yeah, it will be interesting to know what people use. Now, one thing that fascinates me also about Jewish people in the diaspora is trade has played an important role, especially if you're talking about Baghdadi Jews, Iraqi Jews, and then they traveled eastward, and know that the Iraqi Jews also went to India at some point, and there was an exchange of ideas and ingredients. Now, Sarah, there's one ingredient or one dish or condiment which is very popular in Israel, I know, is the amba. So it also has an Iraqi origin. So could you share a bit about that?
Sure. So amber's like, I have to smile when I hear the word amber even. It's just such a beautiful story that I've recently discovered, like put all the dots together finally. Because yeah, the story of amber's fascinating. It almost captures the whole modern history of Iraqi Jews as well. So basically, the Jews would always make a sabich sandwich on Shabbat morning, which is using the eggs of the tabit. A tabit was a traditional dish, which I wrote about in my second children's book. It was, the Ashkenazi Jews, they cook a cholent. It's a 24-hour kind of cooking dish for lunch because you don't cook on Shabbat. So that's also an interesting thing about is Jewish cuisine, how it's influenced by the laws. So for the Iraqis, we'd have tabit, which was chicken and rice, and they'd also cook eggs, and they'd use these eggs in the sandwich. And one of the main ingredients in the sandwich is amba. But where is amba from? Amba is from India. But how did this Indian condiment of pickled mangoes come from India to Iraq? It was because of the fact that Iraqi Jews established communities, strong communities in India. So we have the story of David Sassoon from the Sassoon dynasty. He had to flee Iraq, Baghdad, because of Jewish persecution. So he left in 1829, And they established, so when the Baghdadi Jews went to India, they'd bring other Baghdadi Jews to work for them, work with them, and they were introduced to the mango, and they really liked the mango. They wanted to send it home. But how do you send mango home? You can't send fresh mango. In those days, they'd have to go by ship, it would take time. So they pickled the mango and they sent it back, and it became a key staple dish in the Iraqi Jewish homes. So much so that there were amba stalls set up outside the Jewish schools, and the students would have amba sandwiches, and it became a key ingredient in Iraq. Today, they don't have access to mangoes to pickle them. So I was reading in one of the cookbooks by I don't know how to pronounce her name properly, but it's Nasrallah, Nawal Nasrallah. She wrote The Garden of Delight from the
Eden.
Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful book. And she says that they don't have mangoes to pickle, so they pickled eggplant. And they call it amba as well because that word for pickle is amba. So it became popular in Iraq and throughout the Levant. So now the Iraqi Jews leave to Israel in 1951. The majority of the community leave, and they take with them amba. And suddenly in Israel, you have sabich sandwiches and amba as one of the most popular dishes. It is I had a friend, I was sitting with him, and he said, one of the dishes that it's uncontestably Jewish and has no source in Israel anciently is the amba and the sabich sandwich, because the Iraqi Jews really did bring it with them. And now it's so popular. Even Burger Bar had amba burger, and it's just like part of, like, if you have a falafel, you have amba and shwam. It's just part of the society, just like Iraqi Jews have integrated within Israel, so has their food.
Right. It's very interesting also that you mentioned they got the mango from India and pickling. Pickled mangoes are very common all over India. And the word in many Indian languages, because I only know two Indian languages, but in both languages, the word for mango is actually. So
Interesting.
I don't know whether it has any connection with the word amba again, but
I'm sure it does. I'm sure it
I'm
does.
sure it
is
does. And I
mango.
wonder if Nasrallah, when she speaks about pickled eggplant and calling it amba, they just kind of, because it's pickled mango, will call it also amba because it's pickled eggplant to replace. It's really interesting. The language of food also reflects the history and the
Yeah.
international trade connections.
Yeah, exactly. It's very interesting. And also the Baghdadi Jews, when they came to India, they actually adapted to um getting green chilies and coriander leaves they would put in many of their dishes to make it like trademark Baghdadi Jewish food in India as compared to in Iraq and then back to Israel. Um,
Mm.
okay, so I think that in the second episode we would talk about the Indian Jewish food. We'll talk more about individual dishes. But today I wanted to give a introduction to, the diversity of Jewish food. And I think there's so much that we've learned here. But before we close for today, I'd like to go back to Jennifer and actually kind of come back full circle on that rice and lentil dish. And could you maybe just share a bit about that dish? Maybe how you make it or what it like looks in the end product. And maybe our viewers can say, okay, maybe in my country I have the same dish, whatever it's called, So it's a lot about like learning from one another. We're not trying to steal anything from anyone, but we learn from one another. We adapt, we exchange. So that's the whole point, right? So let's go back to your mujtara dish.
So the mjadra, or rice and lentils, it's very basic, right? It's a sort of a simple dish that I think a lot of people make because it's easy, it's filling, it's not expensive to make, right? So a lot of times that's sort of why certain dishes are done often. And I would say, and it's basically you cook the rice and the lentils separately, but then you bring them together and steam them together. So because you have to pre-cook the lentils a little bit because they're very hard, and it's just the black simple or green lentils. It's not the very hard French kind of lentils. And then I think a very traditional way of serving it is with fried onions on top. And then if we're doing a dairy meal and you're observing the kashrut, the basic kashrut where you are not serving meat with the same meal, then you can serve it with leban, which is a cucumber mint yogurt dressing. So I see similarities, like for example, the rice and lentils. I like to put dishes into families. Like when I talk about certain dishes, or I talk about the family that they belong to. So for example, the rice and lentils, to me is also in the pilaf family, but it's also within another, maybe a cousin or a sibling would be kushri, which
Khichdi.
I've seen. Yeah, Kishli, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, is Indian, right? But
Yeah,
also
in
when you're
Iraq
going
as well,
east,
they say khichdi.
and
Also
Iraq is
kind
right,
of
right. So, and so it's like this combination, I think. It doesn't have to be, again, and it might change because you have the rice, and the rice, the type of rice might be different, even though it tends to be long grain in this region. But it could also be some kind of other lentil, or it could be what they call something in the pulse family, some kind of legume or something like that. So this combination of rice with a bean or a legume or something like that, I think is just, I see it again as a concept. And depending on the region and where people are coming from, they use whatever their background is, what's available. It just makes sense. So
Right.
if the Jews were in Syria, and also I should mention that originally rice was not the most basic grain or staple. It was bulgur wheat, which is a whole other conversation. And then later on, rice came because of trade, especially if you were in Aleppo and you had access to the foods coming from the east. So the Jews who were living in Aleppo, many of them were there, and also Damascus or Sham, right? So the Halabi Jews, they had access to those ingredients first, really, that were coming from the east and going on to the west. And so rice and lentils became a staple, and rice in general became a side dish staple.
Right.
And that's how we would serve it.
So it would actually be interesting to hear from different people, what this rice and lentils looks like. For me, I've grown up also eating red lentils and rice together. You cook in the same pot, maybe put some
Yeah.
vegetables, and also with fried onions as a topping. Some people also put nuts, or so it could be different in different cultures. So
Or
as we,
pasta. In Egypt, I
yeah,
saw they
yeah,
added pasta once,
yeah.
right? And it was like a poor man's dish, but like a one pot, very
Mm-hmm.
filling. And they had kishri stands
Yeah, it's
and chops.
easy, also easy, full of proteins. So
Yeah.
as we end today's episode, now as an intercultural educator, I have to say that respect and active listening are essential to intercultural understanding. What I've noticed is that in the pro-Palestine movement, there often seems to be this unwillingness to hear the Jewish perspective, and I so wish that would change. That people would not see that Jews are trying to steal anything, but it's a case of like we learn from one another. Sure, we might have taken something from you, and you have learned something from me. So it's an interaction process. So thank you, ladies, so much. I myself have learned so much from you. And if there's any closing remark you have for today.
I've I've got one. I've got a powerful one. One of the things I read when I was researching for our podcast is Nawal Nasrallah, so this Iraqi American writer of food from the area. She's really a culinary expert in the area of Iraq and Mesopotamia. She writes, the diversity of Mesopotamian food was also very different from the generally simpler and more basic food that the Arabs and thus the early Muslims were accustomed to. This shows the incredible diversity of food that the early Muslim dynasties acquired as a result of territorial expansion, allowing for the introduction of recipes from Mashraq, Mesopotamia, Persia, Egypt, the Maghreb, and eventually also Andalus. So the point is, this is an area, Mesopotamia was always a very diverse society, and the food reflects that and has always been there from the very beginning. And this is something we reflect now in Israel for sure. And the more we're open to the fact everyone has different food cultures and that our cultures intersect, just like food intersects, just like everyone uses rice in different ways in different cultures. That's an intersection of a food. Our stories intersect, and when we're open to that, we allow for a lot of a peaceful society, and that's what we're aiming for. We share our table, we share our food, and we share our stories, and that's the Jewish way, and that's the way we live in Israel. And that's with the Druze and the Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs and all the Jews from the Middle East, Ethiopia, United States now, Australia, that we're India. We're all together in this, and the food diversity in Israel is astounding and very, very inspiring.
Right. Thank you. Beautiful. Jennifer, any concluding remark?
Well, I don't know. I think Sarah said a lot and probably concluded it in a very good way. But I would just also say that building, since we're talking also about Jewish culture and cuisine and the contributions and what is Jewish, and not necessarily that we are like in the email that started this conversation, that it's about who owns what and who steals and you know who it belongs to. I always, in all my work, wanted to understand the sharing, like you said, of food, the influences of food, never assuming that it was one individual or one culture or community. I think we have to just consider whether it's Jewish or not anywhere in the world. It's about sharing, and whether it's the name of the dish or the group. And the thing about the Jews is that we are not huge in number. We are an ancient community. We're not new, right? So that's important to remember. And we move a lot for lots of reasons. So we're constantly bringing with us and sharing and with another community. So I think that's important as part of understanding what it is to be a Jewish cuisine that may be a little bit different from another cuisine. Is that's a part of it. That's a big part of it, is the constant movement, whether it's migration or trade, business, or you know, persecution. It's about that. It's constantly moving.
Thank you
and
very
rebuilding.
Yeah. So food is a really powerful connector, and we are going to spread light through food and bringing about coexistence and peace, right? So, and we're just getting started. So thank you very much for this.
Yes. Thank you, Pashali.
Thank you.
Thank you.